It's always the obvious questions that are so vigorously discouraged. And one of the questions that's been the most discouraged over the past 30 years are, what are those lines in the sky that you see trailing jets? What is that? Some people call them chemtrails, claim that somehow the US government is spraying on the population. Those people are clearly crazy. Wikipedia calls them crazy. Every news outlet calls them crazy. But the trails are still there. And it's clearly not water vapor, because that doesn't make sense at all. So what are they? We've spent the last 6 months trying to find someone credible who could explain that to us. A serious, sane person with an engineering background who could tell us, what are we looking at? Because we're looking at something. And I don't care what names you call me, I still want to know what it is. And we think we have found that person. Dane Wigington of Northern California has been on this subject for almost 30 years and has compiled what we believe, after looking at it pretty carefully, is the most comprehensive account of what we're seeing. And it's very bad. Never knew what to think of this topic, chemtrails or contrails, or the stripes in the sky that linger after airplanes pass. I don't remember them as a child. They're very common now. I've heard people say there's something up, something nefarious going on. So I go to Wikipedia to see what they say, and I want to read you the Wikipedia entry, the first part of it, on this question, okay? You may have seen this, and I'm quoting from Wikipedia as of this morning. The chemtrail conspiracy theory is the erroneous belief that long-lasting condensation trails left in the sky by high-flying aircraft are actually, quote, chemtrails, consisting of chemical or biological agents sprayed for nefarious purposes undisclosed to the general public, period. Believers in this conspiracy theory say that while normal contrails dissipate relatively quickly, contrails that linger must contain additional substances. Those who subscribe to the theory speculate that the purpose of the chemical release may be solar radiation management, weather modification, psychological manipulation, human population control, biological or chemical warfare, or testing of a biological or chemical agent on the population, and that the trails are causing respiratory illnesses and other health problems. So I read that, and the purpose, of course, of that paragraph is not to illuminate what this might be, but to attack anyone who speculates about what it might be. It's a form itself of psychological warfare, of propaganda. And when I read that, I said to myself, there's clearly something going on, because the people who control Wikipedia, which would be the intel agencies, as we know, don't want anyone to talk about this. So with that lengthy preface explaining why this conversation is taking place, I will turn it over to you to explain, what are these lines in the sky that we have all seen?
There's sprayed particulate dispersion. There is no theory in this equation. Bottom line is, when we have up-close film footage of these aircraft at altitude, KC-10s, KC-135s, C-17 Globemasters, with nozzles visible turning dispersions on and off. This is not, quote, condensation. Geoengineeringwatch.org is the only entity that has taken a NOAA flying lab, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration flying lab, top scientists in it, to sample what these heavy aircraft are emitting at altitude. That sample was processed at Rensselaer Polytechnic in New York, one of the world's most renowned testing institutions. We found exactly what we knew we would find, starting with aluminum nanoparticles. Bioavailable freeform aluminum is toxic to all life, period. That element is named in numerous climate engineering patents as part of a geoengineering dispersion element. So again, there's no theory involved in any of this. And what's so incredibly profound in this equation, Tucker, you have the entire global climate science community, governments all over the world saying we need to put aircraft in the air immediately to disperse light scattering particles. And we use the science terms at geoengineeringwatch.org because the chemtrails term is the instant marginalization term by design. You bring that term up, any elected official won't talk to you anymore. Media will immediately marginalize you. Solar radiation management, stratospheric aerosol injection, cloud albedo enhancement, climate engineering. If we stick to the science terms, they can't marginalize us. So again, this elephant in the sky that we are told is a conspiracy theory is exactly what the entire global climate science community says we need to deploy immediately to slow down the warming of the planet. Stated purpose to deflect some of the sun's incoming thermal energy. We know these programs, not surprisingly, are making a bad situation worse, not better. And Tucker, they're being used as a form of warfare. And we know that. We have countries like Iran, constantly demonized, of course, as you well know. Immediately after 9/11, we have the list of countries to be targeted given to General Wesley Clark, a list that clearly existed before 9/11 even occurred. Subsequently, every one of those countries, every one of them, endured a once in 1,000 year drought. Statistically, mathematically, that's impossible without climate intervention operations. And we have the leader of Iran on the floor of the UN, on film, on the record, stating NATO was cutting off their precipitation. We have Iranian top scientists recently stating NATO's been doing this for 40 years. Destabilize the food supply by destabilizing the rain, and you destabilize the population.
So you just said a bunch of amazing things, all of which I just want to say sound plausible to me. But let's just back up a little bit. So you're calling this geoengineering. The term chemtrails, you say, is a propaganda term designed to discredit people who ask sincere questions about what the hell am I looking at. So,
correct, because if they Google that term, they'll get what you got. And that's what we try to avoid. If anybody is unfamiliar with the issue and they Google that term, that's the end of their search, most likely. So we try to point chess, semantics matter in this case.
Okay, so the first line of the Wikipedia entry points out something true, which is that when you look at these lines in the sky and you're told, well, it's just condensation, it's water vapor, you know that maybe that's not the right explanation, because water vapor dissipates and doesn't remain in the sky for like 20 minutes after the plane leaves. So that suggests bigger particles in the mist, that particulate matter in the mist. Is that correct?
Exactly correct. If you see, for example, breath condensing, if you see some researchers in the Arctic and their breath is condensing because it's very cold, do they get a cloud starting to form over their head? If you have a vehicle that's exhaust is condensing in the morning, you have a freeway with giant clouds hanging over it from the condensation from the vehicles in some cold region? No, that's not how condensation behaves. And again, my journey into this whole battle of now 27 years, but when I built my off-grid home in Northern California, middle of the wilderness, it was the cover of the world's largest renewable energy magazine. I have solar, wind, and hydro. And I was losing, on some days, from what these aircraft are emitting, 50, 60, even 70% of my solar uptake from what these aircraft were emitting. I knew that could not be condensation. When I began to research, I was very surprised at the mountain of information on geoengineering, solar radiation management. And I looked for primary elements. I began to test my precipitation. I hoped I would not find these elements in my rain, because I knew if I did, it would change the entire course of my life. I cannot look the other way. I came up with 7 parts per billion in my first rain test over the next 18 months because I took that long in researching before I was willing to speak out on this issue. At the end of 18 months, I had single rain events with 3,450 parts per billion of aluminum in my rain. This is bioavailable free-form aluminum, which is toxic to all life forms, period. Primary element named in climate engineering patents, and we have the world's most recognized geoengineers specifically stating on film, on the record, their goal of using aluminum in these programs because of its high reflectivity with no consideration of the consequences. That's how I got into this battle.
So if I understand what you're saying, what we're watching is an attempt, I assume by governments, and we'll get into who's doing this, to mitigate the effects of climate change, to reflect back rays from the sun so that the earth doesn't warm at a pace that is dangerous to whatever they think it's dangerous to. But this is a global warming mitigation effort. Is that correct?
That is the stated purpose. We know this is...
That is the stated purpose. So I think that's plausible because there is so much energy, commitment, sincere commitment in some cases, obviously fake commitment in others, and so much money behind this effort to mitigate global warming that makes absolute sense. It is a religion. And you're saying that you were not originally aware of this or interested in it, but because you live off grid and you derive a lot of your electricity from solar and you clearly have an engineer brain, you were wondering, like, why the hell is my solar not working correctly? And that got you into this process of learning about it?
Correct. And I have friends in the solar industry and who, off the record, inform me that some of the commercial solar plants are producing half their design output. And they won't talk about why, because they don't want to lose subsidies. So again, this is a very known element in many fields. In fact, with the nation's weathermen, National Weather Service and NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. There is an illegal federal gag order on all agency operations with those two entities. Why would our government feel the need to gag the weathermen? I had a NOAA scientist state to my face, quote, "We all know this is going on. We have no First Amendment protection. We don't know what to do." So the bottom line is, let's all just pretend this isn't going on while it's virtually dismantling the planet's primary life support systems and ubiquitously contaminating everything everywhere. I'm not just talking about aluminum. We have in lab tests. And again, we've done hundreds of lab tests. We did 500 working with the University of Minnesota, an internationally recognized agricultural institution. We have aluminum, barium, strontium, manganese, surfactants, polymer fibers, graphene, all of this coming down in our breathable air column, Tucker.
Who's doing this specifically?
Ultimately, all roads lead to those who print the money. But we know as far as the coordinating entities, certainly DOD, DARPA, and we have documents to prove the existence of these programs going back decades, documents hundreds of pages long. We have an 800-page U.S. Senate document from 1978 outlining the scope and scale of these programs then, specifically calling for intergovernmental cooperation, even between, quote, otherwise adversarial nations, because of the cross-border ramifications of these programs. You can't just geoengineer over your own country. Who's the biggest player? Obviously, the United States of America, because of the size of our military. The U.S. military has 3 times more aerial tankers, which are the primary aircraft used in these operations, 3 times more than all other militaries in the world combined. And if I could back up to the whole condensation trail narrative again, which is perhaps one of the greatest lies ever perpetrated on populations all over the world, all military tankers and all commercial aircraft are equipped with what's known as a high bypass turbofan jet engine. That's a jet-powered fan. 90% of the air that moves through that engine is not combusted. So by design, that engine is nearly incapable of producing any condensation trail except under rare and extreme circumstances, which are diminishing by the day because of the warming that's occurring in the troposphere. So much warming. We've had 2 former military pilots that fly private aircraft. Important people have contacted us at geoengineeringwatch.org. In both cases, they were off the coast of the Pacific Northwest, and their aircraft were forced into emergency auto descents because the air outside that aircraft was 45 to 50 degrees above what it should have been. The air was not dense enough to carry those aircraft. These people are very, very alarmed, but very afraid to speak out.
That's an amazing fact. And it points up something that I think is indisputably true, which is that the climate is changing. Why it's changing is a whole separate set of debates. Of course, it's always changed.
Climate engineering alone, though, if I could elaborate, climate engineering alone, I'm not negating the other sources of damage to the planet. We've been very poor stewards. But our point at geoengineeringwatch.org is, how could anybody from any perspective, and the environmental left is the most reluctant to face this issue. And we know why, Tucker, because they don't want to lose their 501c3 nonprofits. Our attorneys at geoengineeringwatch.org spoke to attorneys from every major environmental group, Greenpeace, Sierra Club, WWF, all of them. They will not address this issue because they don't want to lose their nonprofit status. Is that not criminal hypocrisy? So we're stating in the case of trapping more heat than it deflects, causing far more harm than any perceived good, they're simply using it as a weapon under the guise of trying to mitigate the climate. So again, these operations are taking us from the frying pan into the fire, so to speak. So again, the greatest, most damaging form of human activity on the planet at this moment in time must be considered these operations, climate engineering.
Well, sure. Geoengineering by its very nature is just like textbook hubris, where you think you're God and you're in charge of the weather and the planet. No, you're just some lumpy, furry schmuck living out an incredibly short lifespan with no ability to make anything better because you're not God. The whole mindset is the mindset that gets us to nuclear war. So I'm opposed to it on those grounds. But before we ascend too much higher, let's just come back down a little bit and to the specifics. So where these aircraft seem to be everywhere in the United States, where are they taking off from? Where do these chemicals come from? The aluminum particulate, the rest that you did, the magnesium, all the rest you described. What's kind of the chain that gets us to the stripes in the sky that we see?
Aircraft are taking off from countless locations. We're aware of a number of military bases where we know they're deploying from. We also have commercial aircraft with commercial markings that we know are being used in these operations. We know that because we have film footage of these aircraft, retrofit nozzles mounted on the wing pylons. We have up-close photographs aimed into the exhaust jet stream to make this look like, quote, condensation. We are not implicating commercial pilots or personnel, but we are communicating with them. Some commercial pilots that distribute our printed materials in pilot lunchrooms, for example, covertly, because they know their aircraft are being used. These are automated systems. They carry a small payload. You might remember about in the year 2000, the weight of the aircraft became a very big deal, how much luggage you carried on, how much weight you carried on. That appears to be when this was implemented. And we also know that the DoD has leased a significant number of commercial aircraft with commercial markings. Why would the DoD need or want that? And again, for the base material, because we're talking about an extraordinary amount of material here, based on our testing with the University of Minnesota, again, about 500 lab tests there, and extrapolating how much material was in the precipitation, projecting that globally, it appears something in the range of 40 to 60 million tons of nanoparticles are being dispersed annually in skies all over the globe. And the smaller the particle, the more toxic it is, the more harmful it is, the more bioavailable it is. And all the official air quality testing by design doesn't even look for these elements, let alone disclose them. So official air quality testing is PM10, 10 microns, occasionally PM2.5. Those are boulders compared to a nanoparticle. You can fit up to 100,000 nanoparticles across the width of a single human hair. They're inconceivably small. And the reason they use such small particles is because they stay aloft longer. And that's the goal. Keep the particles suspended in the atmosphere. And there's more volumetric forcing. There's more surface area the smaller the particle for a given amount of material. So it appears, and we have a published study on this, there is a peer-reviewed published study that implicates coal fly ash as a base material for these operations because it contains many of the elements the climate engineers feel they need to disperse in our skies, and it provides plausible deniability, and it gets rid of a waste product that they're always trying to get rid of. There's other elements added. American Elements Corporation appears to be one of the primary suppliers for these operations. But again, the fact that this can go on in our skies and the mountain of data that exists on this and the continued pretending by the so-called climate science community that this is ongoing is mind-numbing, and they won't be able to hide this for much longer, Tucker. I want to stress that. These programs will be forced to light. And if I could end with this, when those pretend, again, like the Wikipedia definition you read, that this is some sort of an outlandish conspiracy, let's go all the way back to 1962. 63 years ago, President Lyndon Johnson on film, on the record, ranting like a lunatic. It's the first 30 seconds of the weekly commercial-free, non-political Geoengineering Watch national broadcast we put on radios out of our pocket, stations out of our pocket across the country. But the first 30 seconds is this film footage of Johnson stating we had the power to control the world's cloud layer then, and quote, "He who controls the weather controls the world." How far have they come since?
Well, it's that kind of lunatic hubris that, destroys the world. And Johnson was, of course, whether he knew it or not, committed to helping destroy the world. So an evil man, I think, by any metric. So I'm not necessarily surprised. What I am surprised by, however, is the fact that this program, the one you're describing, could have continued for over 60 years at this scale, continental scale, global scale, and no one knows about it or talks about it. I mean, we have a huge government, lots of elected officials. Like, what do they say when you ask them?
This is a bit like the safe and effective narrative, isn't it? Let's all have the entire medical community pretending that injecting toxic heavy metals is safe and effective. And they still pretend to this day that is the case, when it doesn't take a large intellect or an educated individual to understand that's going to do harm. And yet that narrative still continues to this day. So again, this mass psychosis of denial is mind-numbing, but you can't hide this for much longer. And we do have the climate science community now starting to speak out, starting to state how incredibly catastrophic these programs would be if they were implemented. They're not outright admitting it yet, but they're getting closer. And if we look at historical precedent, when did the U.S. military start its modification in hurricanes? And there's some interesting things going on the hurricane front this year, as in none of them. They're being deflected. And people that pretend that you can't manipulate a weather system of that size. That's absolute nonsense. The science completely disputes that. The U.S. military commenced its hurricane modification operations in 1947 with Project Cirrus. And even the results of that initial small-scale testing appeared to have so much effect on a cyclonic rotation that there were lawsuits pending from that, at which time they began to be more covert about their operations.
And you said you'll notice that there aren't hurricanes in Florida. So the last few years, Florida, the west coast of Florida in particular, just been hammered, absolutely destroyed. Billions, tens of billions of dollars of damage done by hurricanes, no hurricanes this year. And you're saying that that's not an accident. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that we know the technology exists to steer storms of that size. And let me make a comparison. You could have a 10-year-old child divert the course of a 100,000-ton freight train by pulling a lever, literally, and changing the tracks.
That's correct.
And that's the kind of small input, massive output that you can have with these cyclonic rotations when they have the ability to manipulate atmospheric pressure zones. This is undisputed, patented science. So why would we think they're not using these type of operations? We have historical precedent. Project Popeye in Vietnam was so successful at controlling precipitation. This is a historical record that by 1976, they passed the INMOD treaties forbidding weather manipulation for wartime purposes, but not over a country's own population. So if we look at the
Can I ask you to stop? I'm sorry. You're throwing.
Please.
I'm so ignorant on this topic, but I'm suddenly very interested that I just want to make sure we don't miss anything. Operation Popeye, is that what you called it in Vietnam?
Correct.
What?
Correct.
I've never even heard of that. I'm embarrassed to say. What is it? What was it?
Very easily researched historical record. U.S. military was so successful at controlling precipitation over Vietnam that the international community was very concerned about this, at least on the surface. And they passed environmental modification treaties in 1976, international treaties forbidding weather manipulation in wartime. So again, when people claim this is conspiracy, we don't have this kind of power and control, and they try to muddy the climate engineering issue as being the localized, publicized cloud seeding operations. Those are two completely different animals. And we see even some state legislators doing the same. And we're trying to correct that at geoengineering.org because we're working with numerous state legislators now and have been. There's legislation pending in 36 states to ban geoengineering over their skies. Tennessee and Florida have already done so. But we're correcting them and giving them an accurate compass heading that the localized, publicized cloud seeding operations, the kind which they tried to implicate in the Texas floods that killed so many young Americans, as being connected to a localized cloud seeding operation, which is virtually meaningless in comparison to climate engineering. It's an ant compared to an elephant. So intentionally, those that control media and are trying to control the narrative are trying to confuse these two issues. They are completely different. They're trying to mask or hide the elephant in the sky, which is climate engineering operations. So again, these programs are historical record. The Chinese government is so successful at, for example, engineering snowstorms. Tucker, do you remember the blizzard in New Orleans this January? You remember that?
No, I don't.
There was a blizzard in New Orleans, first time in recorded history. There was a blizzard in Florida, blizzards on the Gulf Coast. That was January 21st, by the way. That's an interesting date to have that happen. These are demonstrations of what climate engineering can do, and the Chinese government has long since openly stated they were engineering snowstorms with endothermic reacting elements. These are patented elements that can literally transition what should be a liquid precipitation event, a rain event, into snow. And these elements, if people understand they have a first aid kit that sits on their shelf at room temperature for 20 years, you mix the cold pack together, you have ice instantly. That's an endothermic reacting element.
Yes.
That's being spit into cloud moisture. And they were so successful in China, they caused billions of dollars of damage to Beijing, at which time they began to be less open about this. Everybody covered it. CNN, Popular Science, The Guardian, everyone. But if you bring that up here, suddenly you're a tinfoil hat wearing nutcase. On that same day, while it was blizzarding in New Orleans, in the polar regions, Alaska, Greenland, Iceland, Siberia, it was above freezing and raining. Do you remember the deep freeze in Texas, Tucker, a few years ago, 5 years ago, something like that?
Yes, very well. Yeah, it shut down a lot of their grid.
Correct. So when it was below zero in Dallas, it was 33 degrees warmer at the North Pole. Think about that. And that's what we're not told. So when you have, let's look at the COP climate conferences. You know what those are? The international climate conferences that
Yes.
we have periodically. Those conferences are not to change business as usual. They are to force countries to actively or passively participate in climate engineering. So at some of those conferences, the Cancun conference, the Copenhagen conference, we had record low temperatures at the time of the conference in spite of above normal temperatures in all surrounding areas. That's a demonstration of what climate engineering can do. So back to the hurricanes. The deflection of hurricanes so far this year, is that a demonstration to other countries as well as to the power that the U.S. military has to manipulate atmospheric pressure zones? And again, these are patented processes. For listeners that have heard of HARP in Alaska, I'm not sure if you ever heard of that, Tucker, HARP?
No.
Okay, that's images of that exist. There's no dispute as to its function or what the patents outline that it can do. Even Discovery Channel did a long episode, which they've seemed to be taken off the air now, called Controlling the Weather. But that's a weapon of mass destruction. They play it off as a benign research facility. That's an ionosphere heater. It transmits 3.6 million watts of power to the electrically charged ionosphere, causing an electrical chain reaction. They're literally using the atmosphere as a physics lab, which we know they do, right, Tucker? You know of Project Starfish Prime and Project Fishbowl, if you've heard of those. Those are the U.S. military's experiments with detonating hydrogen bombs in the magnetosphere, which they thought could collapse the whole atmosphere. Did that stop them? No, it didn't. So installations like HARP are used to control atmospheric pressure zones. Back to the hurricanes, if you can manipulate atmospheric pressure zones with these directional ionosphere heaters, you can literally manipulate their path. And is that what we see going on? Is that a demonstration to others right now? Does the administration want to not have a big hurricane cataclysm since they've gutted all the emergency protection, everything? Do they not want to fight that battle too right now? We don't know. We can speculate on those things. But the fact that there is nothing that we can call natural at this point is indisputable.
A couple different threads. One, the U.S. military in this country, our military runs propaganda operations against our population, and they do it on social media. And of course, they do it through the conventional media as well, and they have for a long time. But it's certainly gotten more aggressive. So that's illegal. It's immoral. Anyone who participates in that should be in prison. But it happens, and unfortunately, we haven't been able to stop it. So we know that they lie to our population about a whole bunch of things, including what they're doing.
If you enjoyed today's video on Anonymous Official, leave a like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thanks for watching and sticking with us.